Here lies perhaps the most dangerous political myth ever conceived, that wisdom should rule. Plato's philosopher-king represents everything that threatens the very essence of political life. The belief that politics is a problem to be solved rather than a space where free people act together. When I lived through the collapse of political institutions in the 20th century, I witnessed firsthand what happens when people abandon the messiness of public debate for the false promise of expert rule. The technocrats, the party ideologues, the administrative specialists, all claim to possess knowledge that would make politics unnecessary. But politics isn't about finding the right answer. It's about creating a world where different answers can coexist and compete. Plato's cave allegory doesn't lead us toward enlightenment. It leads us away from the light of the public realm where human plurality makes genuine politics possible. Today, as we watch democratic institutions strain under the weight of those who believe governance is too important for ordinary citizens, we must understand why the philosopher-king isn't the solution to political problems. He is the problem. The choice between Platonic wisdom and political freedom isn't academic. It determines whether we preserve spaces where humans can act as the unique beings they are, or whether we surrender to the comfortable tyranny of those who claim to know better. Chapter 1: The Fatal Attraction of Rule by Wisdom. The seductive power of Plato's Republic lies in its promise to eliminate the uncertainty and conflict that characterize political life. Who hasn't felt frustrated watching legislative debates that seem to go nowhere, or witnessing the apparent irrationality of democratic decision-making? Plato offered an elegant solution. Replace the chaos of political opinion with the certainty of philosophical knowledge. The philosopher-king would rule not through force or manipulation, but through pure wisdom, understanding the eternal forms of justice, truth, and the good. This vision has haunted political thinking for over 2 millennia, and its appeal has never been stronger than in our age of expertise. We live surrounded by specialists who claim authority over every aspect of human existence, economists who reduce political questions to mathematical models, social scientists who promise to engineer better societies, policy experts who translate complex human problems into technical solutions. Each generation produces its own version of Plato's philosopher-king, whether they call themselves scientific socialists, technocrats, or evidence-based policymakers. But there's something Plato fundamentally misunderstood about the nature of political life. Politics isn't a problem requiring a solution. It's the space where human beings reveal who they are through their words and deeds. When people gather in public to discuss their common concerns, they aren't seeking the one correct answer to predetermined questions. They're creating a world together through the sheer fact of their plurality and their capacity to begin something new. The philosopher-king represents the ultimate anti-political figure because he stands above the realm where humans meet as equals. His authority derives not from the consent of those he governs, but from his private access to eternal truths. He doesn't need to persuade because he possesses knowledge. He doesn't need to listen because he already knows what's best. Most dangerously, he doesn't need other people except as objects of his rule. Their opinions, their experiences, their particular perspectives become obstacles to implementing the truth he has discovered in solitude. This is why every attempt to realize Plato's vision ends in the destruction of political life itself. The philosopher-king, no matter how benevolent his intentions, cannot help but treat his subjects as children who must be guided toward their own good. Politics becomes administration. Citizens become clients, and the public realm transforms into a space where experts deliver services to passive recipients. Chapter 2: Politics as Plurality, Not Unity. At the heart of my disagreement with Plato lies a fundamental difference about what politics actually is. For Plato, politics was essentially a scaling up of household management, the art of ruling over others to achieve predetermined ends. The philosopher-king would impose harmony and order on the naturally chaotic mass of humanity. much as a wise father guides his family or a skilled craftsman shapes his materials. But this understanding completely misses what makes politics distinct from all other human activities. Politics isn't about ruling or being ruled. It's about acting together among equals. When free people gather in public spaces to discuss their common concerns, they create something that cannot exist anywhere else. A realm where human plurality becomes a source of strength rather than a problem to be solved. Think about what happens in genuine political action. When citizens debate a controversial issue, they don't simply advocate for predetermined positions. Through the process of speaking and listening, they discover new possibilities that none of them could have imagined alone. Their different perspectives, experiences, and insights create a web of relationships that enriches everyone involved. This is what I mean by plurality. Not the mere fact that people are different, but the specifically political condition where those differences become productive rather than destructive. Plato saw plurality as the root of political problems. In the Republic, he imagines an ideal city where everyone performs their designated function in perfect harmony. The guardians protect, the producers work, and the philosopher-king rules, each class pursuing its natural purpose without conflict or confusion. This vision requires the suppression of everything that makes humans distinctly human: their capacity for surprise, their tendency to see things from unique perspectives, their ability to transcend the roles assigned to them by nature or tradition. The tragedy is that Plato's unified state wouldn't solve political problems. It would eliminate politics altogether. When everyone thinks alike and pursues the same goals, there's no need for public debate, no room for dissent, no possibility for the kind of action that allows humans to transcend their circumstances and create something genuinely new. The philosopher-king's subjects would achieve perfect order at the cost of their political existence. This is precisely what I observed in the totalitarian movements of the 20th century. Whether they claimed to embody the will of the proletariat, the destiny of the race, or the demands of scientific socialism, they all shared Plato's fundamental assumption that politics should aim at unity rather than preserve plurality. They succeeded in creating societies where conflict disappeared, but only because they had eliminated the conditions that make political life possible. Chapter 3: The Violence Hidden in Philosophical Rule. Here we must examine something that admirers of Plato's Republic often overlook. The philosopher-king's rule ultimately depends on force, not wisdom. Despite the elegant language about enlightenment and the ascent from the cave, Plato's ideal state requires systematic coercion to maintain itself. The guardians must be separated from their families. Private property must be abolished for the ruling class, and the mass of citizens must be prevented from questioning the fundamental structure of their society. This reveals a crucial truth about the relationship between politics and violence. Genuine political power emerges when people act together in concert, when they voluntarily cooperate to achieve common goals. Violence, by contrast, operates through isolation and domination, one person or group imposing their will on others who have no choice but to obey. These aren't simply different approaches to achieving political ends. They're fundamentally opposed phenomena. The philosopher-king cannot rule through political power because his authority doesn't derive from the consent and cooperation of his subjects. His wisdom, no matter how genuine, cannot create the bonds that unite free people in common endeavors. Therefore, he must rely on the instruments of violence, laws that cannot be questioned, institutions that cannot be challenged, and ultimately force to suppress those who refuse to accept his enlightened guidance. Consider how this dynamic played out in the 20th century's various attempts to create rationally ordered societies. The Bolsheviks claimed to possess scientific knowledge of historical development, and therefore the right to guide humanity toward its destined future. The Nazi ideologues insisted they understood the natural hierarchy of races and the requirements of national greatness. In each case, The rulers justified their use of violence by appealing to truths that supposedly transcended ordinary political debate. The pattern is always the same. Those who claim access to absolute truth cannot tolerate the messy, unpredictable process of democratic deliberation. When people refuse to accept the wisdom being offered to them, the philosopher-kings inevitably conclude that force must be used for the people's own good. The violence isn't a regrettable necessity or a temporary expedient. It's built into the very logic of rule by wisdom. This is why I insist that politics and violence are opposites, not different points on a spectrum. When violence appears in the political realm, it signals that politics has failed or been abandoned. The philosopher-king represents the systematic abandonment of politics in favor of domination, disguised as enlightenment. But there's something even more insidious about Plato's vision. By presenting the philosopher-king as the ideal ruler, he makes violence appear rational and necessary. If the wise truly should govern the ignorant, then resistance to their rule becomes not just mistaken, but morally wrong. The subjects who refuse enlightenment deserve whatever force is necessary to bring them into line with rational order. Chapter 4. The corruption of thinking by power. When philosophers become kings, they don't just corrupt politics, they corrupt philosophy itself. The act of thinking requires a kind of solitude and withdrawal from the immediate demands of practical affairs. The moment thinking becomes instrumental to ruling others, it ceases to be genuine thinking and becomes ideology or propaganda. This distinction is crucial for understanding why Plato's vision fails on its own terms. The philosopher who withdraws from the cave to contemplate eternal truths engages in an activity that is essentially private and non-political. Thinking, in its purest form, is a dialogue between me and myself, a process of questioning and examining that has no immediate practical purpose. It seeks understanding rather than results, insight rather than control. But the philosopher-king must translate his private contemplation into public policy. He must convert the insights gained in solitude into rules for governing others. This transformation fundamentally alters the nature of thinking itself. What began as open-ended inquiry becomes closed dogma. What started as personal understanding becomes imposed truth. I witnessed this corruption repeatedly during my lifetime. Intellectuals who might have been genuine thinkers became ideologists the moment they claimed the right to reshape society according to their insights. The Marxist theorists who reduced all human relationships to class struggle. The racial scientists who explained history through biological categories. The social engineers who promised to eliminate poverty and crime through rational planning. All abandoned thinking for the sake of power. The tragedy is that genuine thinking could never provide a foundation for political authority anyway. The insights that emerge from philosophical reflection are too uncertain, too personal, too dependent on particular circumstances to serve as universal laws. The moment we try to impose the results of thinking on others, we transform wisdom into tyranny. This is what Plato failed to understand about the relationship between philosophy and politics. He assumed that because thinking can illuminate the human condition, it can also direct political action. But these are entirely different activities requiring different faculties and different kinds of engagement with the world. Thinking thrives on uncertainty, questioning, and the willingness to be surprised by new insights. Politics requires the capacity to act with others despite uncertainty, to make decisions without perfect knowledge, and to take responsibility for outcomes that no one can fully predict. The philosopher-king attempts to combine these incompatible demands and inevitably fails at both. Moreover, the corruption flows in both directions. Not only does the desire for power corrupt thinking, but the pretension to philosophical authority corrupts politics. When rulers claim their authority derives from superior wisdom rather than the consent of the governed, they make genuine political participation impossible. Citizens become students at best, subjects at worst, but never the free actors that politics requires. Chapter 5. Why democracy embraces human fallibility. Now we arrive at the heart of why democratic politics represents such a profound alternative to Plato's vision. Democracy doesn't assume that some people possess special access to truth that qualifies them to rule others. Instead, it's built on the recognition that all human beings are fallible, and that this fallibility makes collective decision-making not just necessary, but potentially productive. Consider what happens in a well-functioning democratic debate. No one enters the discussion claiming infallible knowledge about what should be done. Instead, citizens bring their different experiences, perspectives, and insights to bear on common problems. Through the process of speaking and listening, questioning and responding, they develop understanding that none of them possessed individually. This doesn't mean that democracy is simply a method for aggregating ignorance, or that all opinions are equally valid. Rather, democracy recognizes that on political questions about how we should live together, there are no expert authorities whose knowledge trumps the experience and judgment of ordinary citizens. Political wisdom emerges through participation, not through private contemplation. Ask yourself, who is better qualified to judge whether a neighborhood needs a new school? The urban planning expert who has studied demographic trends and educational theory, or the parents who live in the community and understand its particular needs and dynamics? The question reveals the difference between technical knowledge and political judgment. Both are valuable, but they operate in different realms and serve different purposes. The Philosopher-King assumes that political questions can be answered the same way we answer mathematical problems, through the application of universal principles by specially trained minds. But political questions aren't technical problems with correct solutions waiting to be discovered. They're matters of judgment about how human beings should live together given their different needs, values, and circumstances. Democratic politics at its best creates spaces where this kind of judgment can develop through collective deliberation. Citizens don't simply vote for predetermined options. They participate in the ongoing conversation through which those options emerge and evolve. This requires the kind of courage that Plato's subjects never need to develop: the courage to speak in public, to take responsibility for one's opinions, and to act despite uncertainty about outcomes. But democracy demands something even more challenging: the willingness to be persuaded by others, to change one's mind when confronted with better arguments or new evidence. The Philosopher-King never needs to learn this skill because he already possesses the truth. Democratic citizens must cultivate it constantly because they recognize that their initial understanding of any situation is necessarily partial and incomplete. This is what I mean when I say that politics is the realm of freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever one wants, but the freedom that emerges when people act together despite their differences and create something new that none of them could have achieved alone. Chapter 6: The Art of Judgment versus the Rule of Knowledge. The faculty that makes democratic citizenship possible is judgment, the ability to navigate particular situations without universal rules, to discriminate between better and worse without claiming absolute knowledge. This is precisely what Plato's Philosopher-King lacks. Despite his access to eternal truths, judgment operates in the realm of particulars, while the Philosopher-King deals in universal abstractions. Think about how judgment actually works in political life. When citizens evaluate a political candidate, they don't apply a predetermined formula or consult a philosophical manual. They consider the candidate's character, experience, and proposals in light of their community's specific needs and circumstances. They weigh competing values and priorities, knowing that perfect solutions don't exist and that every choice involves trade-offs. This process requires what we might call political taste, the ability to discern what fits a particular situation and what doesn't. Like aesthetic taste, political judgment cannot be reduced to rules or taught through instruction. It develops through experience and practice, through participating in the ongoing conversation of political life. The philosopher-king, by contrast, approaches political problems as technical challenges requiring the application of universal principles. He believes that once he understands the eternal form of justice, he can deduce what justice requires in every particular case. This eliminates the need for judgment because the correct answer is already determined by philosophical knowledge. But here's what this approach misses. Political situations are always unique, always embedded in particular histories and circumstances that cannot be captured by universal categories. The attempt to govern through abstract principles inevitably does violence to the complexity of human affairs. Real people get reduced to instances of general types. Actual communities become examples of theoretical models, and the rich particularity of political life gets flattened into administrative categories. Democratic judgment works differently. It begins with the recognition that we cannot know in advance what any situation demands. We must approach each political challenge as genuinely new, requiring fresh thinking and creative response. This is why democratic politics is always experimental, not because Democrats lack principles, but because they understand that principles must be interpreted and applied through judgment rather than mechanical calculation. The cultivation of judgment requires public spaces where citizens can practice making discriminations, testing their opinions against those of others, and taking responsibility for the consequences of collective decisions. These spaces cannot be created by philosopher-kings because they depend on the equality of participants. Judgment emerges between equals, not between rulers and subjects. This is why I insist that the public realm is so crucial for human flourishing. It's not just a nice addition to private life or a necessary evil for coordination problems. It's the space where human beings develop their distinctly political capacities, the ability to act together, to judge particular situations, and to create new possibilities through collective deliberation. When philosopher-kings eliminate genuine public spaces in favor of rational administration, they don't just change the method of governance, they atrophy the human faculties that make political life possible. Chapter 7: Preserving the Space for Human Action. The ultimate stakes in the conflict between Platonic wisdom and political freedom are nothing less than the preservation of human uniqueness itself. When philosopher-kings rule, they don't just govern badly. They eliminate the conditions under which human beings can reveal who they are through their words and deeds. They create a world where everyone becomes predictable, where surprise becomes impossible, where the capacity for beginning something genuinely new atrophies from disuse. This is what I call the space of human action, the realm where people can transcend their given circumstances and create possibilities that didn't exist before. Action in this sense isn't just any kind of activity. It's the specifically human capacity to initiate something unprecedented, to break the chains of cause and effect that govern the natural world. Every genuine political revolution exemplifies this capacity. When the American founders declared independence and created new forms of government, they weren't simply applying philosophical principles they had learned from books. They were acting in response to their particular situation, creating institutions that had never existed before, taking responsibility for outcomes they couldn't fully predict. The philosopher-king cannot tolerate this kind of action because it threatens the rational order he seeks to establish. If people can genuinely begin something new, then his carefully constructed system becomes vulnerable to disruption. Therefore, he must eliminate the conditions that make action possible: the plurality of perspectives, the unpredictability of public debate, the willingness of citizens to take risks for the sake of their common world. But when action disappears, something essential to human nature disappears with it. People become specimens to be administered rather than actors capable of surprising themselves and others. Politics becomes a matter of managing processes rather than creating possibilities. The future becomes simply an extension of the present rather than an open space for human creativity. This is why the choice between Plato's Philosopher-King and democratic politics isn't just about different forms of government. It's about different ways of understanding what human beings are and what they're capable of achieving. The Philosopher-King sees humans as rational animals who can be perfected through proper guidance. Democratic politics recognizes humans as beings capable of transcending their circumstances through action with others. In our current moment, as experts claim ever more authority over political decisions and citizens feel increasingly powerless to influence the forces shaping their lives, we face a version of Plato's ancient choice. Will we surrender our political capacities to those who claim superior knowledge? Or will we take responsibility for preserving the spaces where human action remains possible? The answer requires not just intellectual understanding, but the courage to act, to participate in public life despite its messiness and uncertainty, to take responsibility for our common world despite our individual limitations, to preserve the possibility that human beings might yet surprise themselves by creating something genuinely new together. Conclusion: the Philosopher-King promises order, efficiency, and the elimination of political conflict. He offers to solve the problems that have plagued human communities since the beginning of recorded history. But his solution requires the sacrifice of everything that makes us human: our plurality, our capacity for judgment, our ability to begin something new through action with others. Democratic politics offers no such grand solutions. It promises only the preservation of spaces where human beings can continue to reveal who they are through their words and deeds, where the unexpected remains possible, where the future stays open to human creativity. This choice confronts every generation anew. In our time, as technical expertise claims ever more authority over political decisions, we must decide whether we will preserve the conditions that make genuine politics possible or surrender them for the false security of rule by wisdom. The stakes could not be higher. Not just different forms of government, but different ways of being human in the world. The Philosopher-King's cave leads not toward enlightenment, but away from the light of the public realm, where human plurality creates the conditions for political freedom. Our task is to keep that light burning for future generations who deserve the chance to act together as free equals, creating possibilities none of us can imagine alone.